Thank you, everyone, for coming. Welcome to another Socialist Night School. My name is David Kaib. I'm one of the organizers of the Night School. My pronouns are he and him. The Metro DC DSA Socialist Night School is a series of sessions that explore basic ideas, concepts, and historical events related to socialism. So we're at near the beginning of our fifth semester, where so far we've covered what is socialism. And so tonight is our second class for the fifth semester. At the end, we'll announce some additional ways you can get involved if you're interested in that in the chapter. And so our presenter tonight is going to be Chip Gibbons. He's the co-chair of the Metro DC DSA Political Education Working Group. He's also a journalist whose work has been published in Jacobin and The Nation, among other places. So I'm going to turn it over to Chip, but I will say that if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to those at the end.
Thank you everyone tonight for joining us. My name is Chip Gibbons, he, him pronouns, as David said. So in the event description, I included this quote from Marx, and it's one of my favorite quotes to start with. It comes from the first volume of Capital, and it is, "Capital is dead labor, which vampire likes, lives only by sucking living labor, and lives the more labor it sucks." Now, there's a bunch of reasons why I like to start with this quote. For one thing, it's quite literary. Also, it's almost Halloween, and we're talking about vampires. But even beyond just being sort of a cool quote about vampires, it really encompasses to me how Marx viewed how capitalism functioned, which is rooted in how Marx viewed the wage-labor relationship, which is what we're going to largely explore tonight in this presentation. The introduction to Marxism that we've done all 5 semesters and even before this night school started focuses very heavily on Marx's political economy, especially as outlined in volume 1 of Capital and in the book Wage, Labor, and Capital. We don't go into other things like what are dialectics or Hegel or things like that, but just sort of focusing on how Marx viewed capital as a system and how it functioned, because I think that's what's probably most necessary for people who are socialist to know. The other thing I will say is that I am a Marxist, but this is not a polemical presentation. The purpose of this presentation is not to explain how I as a Marxist am right and other people as non-Marxist are wrong, but to give you an understanding of what is Marxism. Because Marxism has been probably the most influential ideology within the socialist movement. Everything from social democratic parties to like Marxist, Leninist, communist organizations have all claimed some sort of Marx or Marxism as their influence at one point. Obviously, those are very different things they must have taken from it, but just because it is so overarching in the socialist world, and because it is not always clear what is Marxism, I think it's important to have this presentation. So let us start with the first question. What is Marxism? Marxism, as the name would suggest, stems from Karl Marx. He's a German theorist. He lived and worked during the 19th century. Contemporary Marxists obviously draw from Marx, adopting his framework and method of analysis, but they build on Marx, sometimes rethinking or even disagreeing with some of the actual claims Marx made, sometimes not. Even within Marxism, there are a wide range of views. So if there's one thing you take away tonight from me, it's that Marxism is a dynamic and living theoretical canon, not a stale political platform handed down from the 1800s without alterations or adaptation. I know sometimes people will be like, oh, Marx wrote in the 19th century. How is that relevant to me? You just want to sort of funnel everything into this 19th century analysis. And if you were, solely reading Marx, I think you would get a lot of things out of it. But, that is a not invalid point. But there have been Marxists since Marx who have written about other things. So Marxism is a method of analysis, not like here are 10 political facts about 1880s Manchester, England. The other really important thing to remember is that Marx was primarily a theorist of capitalism, not someone who wrote quote unquote recipes for the kitchens of the future. Marxist theories in general tend to grapple with understanding and explaining capitalism. So you're not going to hear tonight a blueprint for socialism. You are going to hear how Marxists believe capitalism function. And how Marxists believe capitalism function is obviously important to why socialists oppose it and how they want to move on. So a note on Marxism and methodology and abstractionism after I have a quick drink of water. Marx was particularly interested in getting to the heart of capitalism. As such, he sought to abstract many of the particulars to get at the most basic things driving the system. He did not remain solely on the abstract plane, but rather moved back and forth between capitalism, the system, and the particulars of factory life, parliamentary battles, business, etc. So you'll see in like Capital Volume 1, Marx will do this thing like assume away this, assume away that, and have this really super abstract notion of capitalism. And people will sometimes think that's all he did. And then the next chapter, he'll be like, here are some really specific, here's a parliamentary report. And the reason for that is that Marx wanted to both show how capitalism ultimately functions, as well as sort of the underlying rules and sort of laws of motion of a capitalist system. Some things people believe Marx failed to anticipate, the roles of banks, corporations, et cetera, are actually discussed by him later. Abstraction is important, not because it allows us to see the underlying forces of how capitalism operates. So we've just discovered that Marxism is a theory of how capitalism works. So then what is capitalism? So capitalism is a system that we are part of every day. It's omnipresent, but attempting to define it, especially when thinking about a non-capitalist society, either pre or post looks like, can be really challenging to grapple with. Even amongst Marxists, there's some debate about what the precise contours of capitalism are, when or how it began, and how and why it will end. But a few general points of agreement can be broadly stated. One is private ownership. The means of production, i.e. the necessary tools, equipment, etc., needed to produce the basic materials of a society, anything from factories that produce cars or other consumer goods to commercial agriculture that produces food, are privately held in our society. There exists a group of people who don't own any means of production, and thus, in order to subsist, they must sell their labor. The wealth they produce, however, is not theirs. It belongs to those who own the means of production, i.e. the small number of capitalists, and we're going to get to more of this later. It's important to think less about who owns the means of production than about the underlying relationship. For example, Engels was a collaborator of Marx, stated very clearly that nationalization of industry could occur, and that would be the end, but that would not be the end of capitalism, beginning of socialism. Additionally, in our contemporary context, we seldom encounter situations with like a dude in a monocle, like the Monopoly man, like personally owns a factory, as opposed to a corporation. Of course, many corporations issue stocks, which complicates the picture further. The other big thing about capitalism from a Marxist perspective is that it's a system based on production for profit. A famous quote from a CEO of US Steel, when asked why they were closing down factories and laying people off, he said, US Steel is in the business to make profits, not steal. So they're making money, not steal. So per Marx, commodity is something that has a use value, what it actually intends to be used for, and an exchange value, i.e. the cost it could be sold for. So let's take an example of a chair. A chair has a use for sitting on, or if you're me, leaving all your unfolded clean laundry on. It also has an exchange value, what it's sold for, $50, or maybe if you go to some obscene store like Crate and Barrel, $500. But those are two different types of values, the use of it and what you can exchange it for. Under capitalism, production is not designed to meet human needs, but for profit. This produces really perverse results, such as vacant homes alongside homelessness and the building of new homes, or an overproduction of food that can be sold profitably alongside starvation. So let's discuss the relationship between use, exchange value, and profit. From the point of view of the capitalist, labor is only productive if it produces an exchange value. For example, someone could bake a delicious loaf of bread and eat it themselves. From the point of view of capitalism, that would be unproductive labor. Even if this person had a very hungry friend, or maybe a homeless person, and they gave it to them out of the kindness of their heart, they're still, from the standpoint of capitalism, unproductive. However, if a person works in a commercial bakery and they make a loaf of bread, and the loaf of bread is sold at a profit. From the standpoint of view of the capitalist, this is productive. This is true even if the person who buys the bread doesn't eat it or does something terribly useless with it. Another example of this would be a stay-at-home parent. From the perspective of capitalism, is quote unquote not productive, but a daycare worker would be. And this is clearly nonsensical in the real world. And I just want to flag the example of the stay-at-home parent versus the daycare worker, because that's really important for later theories of Marxist feminism that come out in the 20th century about what types of labor is paid and unpaid and how that's gendered. So going back to the capitalist, productive versus unproductive is based on exchange value, not use value. The other standpoint of capitalism is accumulation. Accumulate, this is Moses and the prophets, is something Marx explains in Capital. Capitalists make profits so they can use the profits to make more profits, a wonderfully nihilistic system. Capitalists are compelled to ruthlessly maximize profits and accumulate capital by competitive pressures they are subjected to under capitalism. The classic formulation of this by Marx is MCM prime, money, commodity, money prime, or more money. The capitalist starts with money, which he uses to buy quote unquote commodities, in this case, raw material and labor power, which once again, we'll get to that in more detail later, and machinery. They then sell a finished product, also a commodity, for more money than they started. They then take this larger amount of money to buy a larger amount of commodities and sell that for even more money. This cycle continues forever, in theory, or until a terminal crisis and the system breaks down, or an environmental apocalypse, or the Bolsheviks come and storm the Winter Palace. Take your pick. And I am, of course, in this scenario, thinking of a competent capitalist, not someone like Donald Trump, who just sort of hemorrhages money and continuously goes bankrupt, and if he had just stayed at home with his father's money, would be wealthier than if he bought a bunch of useless golf courses and casinos, which is a subset of capitalist problems we are not going to explore in this presentation. So this brings me to the relationship between capitalist profit and the class struggle. So let's talk about wage labor. Wage labor predates capitalism, but it becomes really the predominant form of labor only under capitalism. Under the wage labor relationship, labor power is commodified. Marx, in his later writings, and he went back and revised his earlier writings to remove the phrase labor in terms of commodification of labor and replace it with labor power. Labor power is the power to labor over an agreed period of time, as opposed to labor, which is the capacity to work and can't be alienated from oneself and thus exchanged. So the worker sells his labor power to the capitalist, i.e. a wage. I personally find the distinction between labor power and labor to be kind of a little bit pedantic, but since Marx felt important enough about it, I feel the need to share his definition, even though I do strive to be light on jargon in this presentation. That's just something that seems worth mentioning. So for workers, wage labor is not generally a choice. One either works or fails to get the means of subsistence. So that is wage labor. What about capitalist profit? So as mentioned before, the capitalist ends up with more money than he started out with. And once again, I have a note here, assuming he's doing things right. The difference in money is obviously profit, but how does the capitalist end up with more money? Per Marx, put most simply, the worker produces more in value than they are paid for. The profit stems from the difference between what the worker is paid and the value of what the worker produces. Marx gives us the phrase surplus value. So this brings me to class struggle. So the capitalist obviously has an interest in paying the least amount possible, barring the workers have subsistence wages and all die of starvation and no one can work. And the worker obviously doesn't have this as their interest. So at the heart of the relationship between labor and capital in capitalism is one of mutually exclusive interest. It doesn't matter how nice the capitalist is or how bad the worker is. The source of capitalist profit is based on paying the worker as less as possible for the value of what they produce. The worker wants to get as much of the value they produce as possible. So you have class conflict. I have a note in my outline here about class and abstraction. The working class does not equal a specific body of people in Marxism, but an ongoing process. So it isn't like these people in overalls over here, though they're workers because they wear overalls. It is a relationship in which people who do not have access to the means of production sell their labor power in order to subsist. So let's talk about the working day. The working day appears as an example of the relationship between capitalist profit and class struggle. Let us examine it. One of the most prominent labor struggles was over the length of the working day. To clarify, this is less hours for the same pay. So if you're making $180 a day for 12 hours of work, you would be fighting for $180 a day for 10 hours of work. Obviously, this is very different than when, say, workers today who make an hourly wage have wages reduced, resulting in less income, or when capitalists reduce hours so they don't have to provide people certain legal benefits. That's very different than what we're talking about, though a very real problem and a real struggle. So obviously, there are some hard limits to the working day. The worker must sell enough, must have enough time to reproduce their labor power. If the working day is too long, then the worker can't replenish themselves. But beyond that, things are pretty much up in the air. Obviously, the longer the working day, the more surplus value the capitalist extracts. So the capitalist has an interest in a longer working day. The worker, however, wants a shorter working day. How then is the working day determined? I'm going to take another brief sip of water because I am extremely parched. I was having a home improvement crisis, I guess. I live in an old house. Before this, I didn't get a chance to properly hydrate, so I apologize, I'm a little bit discombobulated. We see then, so how is the working day determined? Here's a quote from Marx in Capital that I really like. We see then that apart from extremely elastic bounds, the nature of the exchange of commodities itself imposes no limit to the working day, no limit to surplus labor. What the capitalist maintains his right as a purchaser when he tries to make the working day as long as possible and to make, whenever possible, 2 working days out of 1. On the one hand, the peculiar nature of the commodity sold implies a limit to its consumption by the purchaser, and the laborer maintains his right as a seller when he wishes to reduce the working day to one of definite normal duration. There is here, therefore, an anonymity, right against right, both equally bearing the seal of the law of exchanges. Between equal rights, force decides. Hence, it is that in the history of capitalist production, the determination of what is the working day presents itself as the result of a struggle between collective capital, i.e. the class of capitalists, and collective labor, i.e. the working class. So Marx is documenting here in this context, which is the United Kingdom, how there was a struggle between workers and capitalists over the working day, and sort of the balance of class forces, the balance of class struggle is ultimately what determined the length of that day. We know this is not unique to the United Kingdom. There was a pretty hard-fought battle for an 8-hour day in the US, and it was through the collective action on the part of the working class that won it. May Day, which is celebrated as a socialist holiday around the world, actually commemorates the police murder of anarchist labor activists who were protesting in Chicago for an 8-hour working day. And obviously, the struggle over the working day is still relevant. Many people have perhaps been required to check email on weekend or evenings, or perhaps you're like me and for some reason you let your work email just dump into your personal email. Or maybe you've been made to stay late or had to work before or after clocking in or out. So we see how this struggle, it isn't just a 19th century thing. We see how the working day is still important. So let us discuss the capitalist workplace. Due to its drive to accumulate, capitalism oftentimes alters the structure of work itself. This is, of course, a continuous process. One of the features of the capitalist workplace is control. It's the primary feature. Capitalism requires the capitalist to take control of the work process into their hands. As the capitalist seeks to control the work process more, this changes the work process. Division of labor and deskilling is another part of the capitalist workplace. So this part comes from a book called Labor and Monopoly Capital, the Degradation of Work in the 20th Century by, I believe, Harvey Braverman. And he argues there's a distinction between social division of labor and a manufacturing division of labor. For example, whether someone is a fisherman or a weaver is a social division of labor, and manufacturing division is when workers do different parts of the same process. So if we're on an assembly line and I'm putting the windshield wipers on the car and you're putting the wheels on. The initial division of labor creates occupations, but the further division results in the destruction of occupations. And this further division encompasses a deskilling. So for example, early on, a handful of workers would create an automobile. A worker under this situation would have the knowledge and the skill to create an entire automobile from start to finish. As capitalism developed, individual workers became responsible for doing only one part of the task, installing windshield wipers, putting tires on. That's the example in my notes, as well as the one I gave off the cuff just earlier. That shows how much I know about cars, that the only thing I can think about with them are windshield wipers and tires. Do not come to me for automotive advice, is I think the takeaway here. This means no one worker knows how to complete the entire process, only part of it. This also means they have less control over their work, less control over their workplace. This increased control coincides with the monopoly of knowledge, a separation of conception from execution. And this is the direct result of the drive for accumulation. The division of labor increases speed in a society based on buying and selling labor power. This reduces cost. Think how much some handcrafted artisanal product costs versus the mass-produced version of the same thing. And then another part of the capitalist workplace is concentration of workers. As capitalism developed and moved from the early stages into the industrial stage, and to be clear, industrial capitalism is neither the first type of capitalism nor the last type of capitalism. More and more workers became employed by the same employer, work became centralized, and a lot of Marxists will argue that that process itself is what lays the groundwork for socialism to be created, now that we have all the workers centralized in this one place. So let's discuss what I think is one of the most interesting observations or theories of Mr. Karl Marx, which is the reserve army of labor. In addition to the working class that is employed, there are amongst the working class those who are under or unemployed, people who are able to work but are not given jobs, and also people who are just unable to work. Marx says these people constitute a reserve army of labor. This reserve army of labor, per Marx, is a function of capitalism. So think about supply and demand. This might seem sort of counterintuitive or bizarre at first, but if you think about sort of the idea of supply and demand, it starts to make sense. If there are not enough workers to do all the work that is to be done, obviously the cost of their labor power is going to be higher, and thus the surplus value extracted by the capitalist is going to be lesser. If there's a large unemployed population and more people looking for work than jobs, obviously the cost of labor power will be cheaper, more surplus value. And there's a number of factors at play here about what causes the size of this reserve army of labor, but the most interesting to me, I think, is what Marx noted about the relationship between worker productivity and reserve army of labor. Maybe some of you watching have seen those charts where they show like average worker productivity since the 70s versus like average income. And that's sort of what we're talking about here in a way. So the greater productivity of labor means it takes a fewer number of workers to do what it previously took a larger number. So if 5 workers with a machine can build a car in the time it took previously 10 workers to do, then you only need 5 workers and less people are employed. Therefore, in the words of Marx, the higher the productiveness of labor, the greater is the pressure of the laborers on the means of employment, the more precarious, therefore, becomes their conditions of existence. There's this very famous essay by Keynes that people bring up sometimes, especially people who are interested in a universal basic income, where he talks about the future crisis for all. Keynes was writing in the early 20th century about the future problem his non-existent grandchildren would have, that he imagined would that there'd be too much leisure time, right? Technology would be so labor saving, his grandchildren and people would have an abundance of free time. What would they do with it? And the reality is that we don't have an abundance of free time. We have people working 2, 3 jobs to try to piece together what they used to be able to get on one job. And people are working longer, they're working harder, things are more precarious. And you wonder, well, how can that be so if there's all this labor saving technology? And if you think about what Marx is saying here, it starts to make sense. And obviously, these are sort of broad theories. Not every specific example conforms with them, but there's a broader trend at work here. So let's talk about capitalist accumulation and the reserve army. So remember earlier we talked about NCM prime. That's simply speaking, the capitalist starts out with money and ends up with more money, i.e. profit. So as the capitalists, they accumulate capital to seek to make more profit. As they make more profit, they tend to reinvest the money in labor-saving technology or other ways to increase the productivity of labor, which means there's a constant push to displace workers. There's a structural logic at play here. As Marx says, it establishes an accumulation of misery corresponding with accumulation of capital. Accumulation of wealth at one pole is therefore at the same time the accumulation of misery, agony of toil, slavery, ignorance, brutality, mental degradation at the opposite pole, i.e. on the side of the class that produces its own product in the form of capital. And then one of the final things I want to talk about tonight, this is, I think, one of the sections that strays the most from Capital Volume 1, but not entirely, is on the relationship between state repression and capital, which is a topic of immense interest to me personally. So while Marx appreciates the advances capitalism made, scientific changes to the work process, mass production, increased efficiency when used to exploit the worker for capitalist profit are bad, but they could be used to provide for human necessity, i.e. socialism, in a way that previous societies could not. He also, in the first volume of Capital, notes the violent origins of capitalism, what he calls primitive accumulation. So there's a role of the state in the origins of wage labor, and it is not pretty at all. So early on in England, people lived off the land. They had some sort of communal rights. The first accumulation of capital, which is what Marx means by primitive accumulation, begins with the expropriation of this communal land. This had the effect of freeing a population to become wage laborers. They now own nothing but their labor power. It also frees them of legal constraints, preventing their participation in wage labor markets, such as slavery or serfdom. So wage labor requires both workers that can only gain access to the means of production by selling their labor power and workers who are free from such legal constraints. Thus, the freedom from feudal duties and the freedom from land or other means of subsistence are a prerequisite for modern wage labor. Early modern free labor was found in places of coercion, orphanages, workhouses, orphanages again. Note free labor in quotation marks. And then Marx documents over several centuries what he calls the bloody legislation against the expropriated, which was sort of using state violence, sometimes in the form of quite horrific corporal or capital punishments to force people to become wage laborers. So you would see increasingly grotesque punishments for not being employed in wage labor, or increasing punishments for being a beggar. And Marx goes through year by year for over a couple hundred years in his book, just describing how these get sort of more gruesome and just, shocking. And then there's the issue of capital punishment in reinforcing capitalist property relations. So Marxist social historians, not socialists, but socialists and social historians like Douglas Hay, E.P. Thompson, Peter Linebaugh have all examined pretty intensely the use of capital punishment in 17th century England. And I know what you're saying. How can capital punishment in the 17th century England be of any interest to me? But I assure you what's coming next is quite interesting. So England, or the United Kingdom, implemented what's called the Bloody Code. That is the number of capital offenses, those carried the death penalty, went from 20 to over 300 in a relatively short period of time. Lo and behold, these new crimes carrying the death sentence were all mostly property offenses. So theft had previously been punished in the United Kingdom by death. So why are we having new death sentences for theft? Well, these property crimes consisted of things that would previously have not been considered theft, but customary rights. Thus, as capitalism redefined property relations, state terror was instrumental in making them more concrete. This is true to an extent today, but it's worth noting that property relations are not enforced through violence alone. Ideology plays a huge role. We accept that taking capitalist property is theft, but that extracting surplus value is just good old economics. Ideology, of course, as demonstrated, both buttresses repression and repression buttresses ideology. So critical legal theorist Duncan Kennedy has said that, all kinds of people of higher social classes are constantly dunning and drilling into the heads of people of lower social classes than their own, that all kinds of things that the people at the bottom want can't be had simply because they're illegal. The idea of the legal and the illegal is something which if you can use to exercise great power over people who believe in it. So early on in sort of the transition to capitalism, people were not willing to accept that certain forms of customary rights where workers were allowed to take home some of their work supplies or, take off with some of the things in the workplace if they weren't paid enough wages, or they could forage and gather in the woods. They weren't willing to say, no, this is ridiculous. These are customary rights. So there was this need for this sort of intense violence to subdue them. Today, many people don't need violence or state repression to get them to not steal things or take things from the capitalist. They've internalized this idea of legal or illegal and generally accept the framework. Another fun thing about capitalism is how free markets tend to give us unfree people. So the quote unquote neoliberal era of capitalism, which is the one that we, I guess, still live in, was supposed to be an era of decreased state intervention into the market. Perversely, at the same time, we've seen sort of a desire to have decreased state intervention in the market. There's also been a massive rise of policing, incarceration, and militarization. Sometimes it's because these policies are implemented forcibly onto people against their will, as was the case with Chile, where there was a coup that removed a socialist government and implemented a Pinochet, who implemented some of the first neoliberal policies. I believe just today or yesterday, the people of Chile voted to do away with Pinochet's constitution. Congratulations to them. But also, there's also something else going on here, which is just generally the withering away of social safety nets and workers' rights decreases social stability. Lo and behold, the market requires some degree of social stability. So let's go back to the reserve army of labor. So unemployment creates an increased reserve army of labor, which drives down wages. But masses of unemployed individuals can also pose quite a danger to the normal functioning of capitalism. They can get themselves in quite a bit of trouble from the perspective of the capitalist class. So it's no coincidence that in the US during the neoliberal era, you saw a skyrocketing increase in mass incarceration and an increase in the prison population. I'm not sure if the trend is anymore, but like a decade ago, when I first started doing talks about, mass incarceration in the US, you'd see these numbers that since 1980, it's quadrupled. And that year would also be arguably the year in which the neoliberal experiment begins. So this sort of ending the tyranny of big government and regulation also accompanied putting more people in prison than any society has ever done throughout history. And a really important point here, and I would be remiss not to mention it, is that we should think about in the US how the continued role of racial oppression determines how state violence is felt and which populations it's directed against. Just at the same time, which populations are hit the hardest by neoliberalism more generally. Different Marxists have different views on how racial oppression and capitalist exploitation functions together. I would argue in the US context that, especially in the apartheid Jim Crow South, you had a racial caste system or a hierarchy of labor where, based on people's race, you were able to hyper exploit them, and that this system of race was enforced through both judicial and extrajudicial violence. So, Jim Crow laws, also Klan terrorism, bombings, lynchings, things like that, which oftentimes bore the sanction of the state. And that's one of the reasons why when the Communist Party went down south in the 30s to organize workers in Alabama, they ended up so heavily involved in fighting to save the Scottsboro boys from the death penalty, in fighting against lynching, in fighting against police violence, and in fighting against what they called racial chauvinism. Many people on the left today have these sorts of elongated, convoluted debates like, what's the relationship between race and capital? Can we just focus on race or just focus on capitalism? This is so difficult to think about. And yet, for the communist who actually had to organize a predominantly Black but still multiracial working class in apartheid conditions marked by racial terrorism, they actually didn't have any difficulty at all figuring out how racism was buttressing capitalist exploitation. Lo and behold. I have finished my presentation. I apologize if I was a bit off or discombobulated. Like I said, I had a bit of an unexpected home crisis before beginning this, which was not on my calendar for this evening. So I hope I was not too awful. Does anyone have questions?
So yeah, we'll ask people, if you have questions, you can type them in for us in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And once we have some, I can read them off to Chip.
And do you have any rejoinders or things you'd like to add, David?
Not that I can think of, but if anything comes to me, I will we'll let you know.
No questions. Presentation was great. Thank you, Eleanor. I appreciate that. This is like my 7th time giving it. So
we do have a question. To what extent is cultural Marxism a legitimate thing going on?
I would say not at all. Cultural Marxism is this weird right-wing meme about this sort of shady. I don't even always understand what it is they're talking about, but like there's books about feminism in the library. This is cultural Marxism. There's some sort of attempt to destroy Western civilization with cultural Marxism. Usually, if they're more intelligent, that someone has pointed out that cultural Marxism equals Jews, and that the fact that cultural Marxism is a anti-Semitic code word in most cases. I think that is very correct. To a limited extent, cultural Marxism delves from sort of this idea of the Frankfurt School, which was a series of sort of Marxist or post-Marxist or neo-Marxist theorists, largely in the post-World War II era. He sort of moved away from the type of political economy that I'm talking about and wrote more about culture broadly. That's not something that I write about, and that's how you get people doing like, Marxist Freudian interpretations of Alfred Hitchcock films, which is an interesting thing, but not something I feel qualified to talk about, even though I do read a lot of Marx and I do watch an excessive amount of Alfred Hitchcock films. Did that answer the question, or did I just go off?
No, I think
it's a right-wing conspiracy theory, and It's been largely supplanted now by quote-unquote critical race theory. Critical race theory is a real academic discipline taught in law schools. I took critical race theory when I was in law school. It has, there's many things wrong with critical race theory, I think, but it has no bearing between what people who rail and rant about critical race theory, as far as I can tell, which sort of veers between like people are talking about racism and I don't like it, right? Like saying that the United States was impacted by slavery and racial oppression. That's not critical race theory. That is historical analysis. And also it comes back with this sort of conspiracy theory that people are trying to influence or infiltrate Western cultural institutions in order to undermine the society from within. When I was, in high school during the Bush era, there was a lot of fights about librarians were against censorship. And this one fringe right-wing website explained that it was because the libraries were influenced by Gramsci. They wanted everyone to be looking at obscene material at the library, and that would weaken our moral resolve and cause the society to collapse. Gramsci, to the best of my knowledge, never wrote about filters at the library, but, and Gramsci was an Italian Marxist who wrote about sort of cultural hegemony. So he sort of looms large in the minds of the more sophisticated right-wing demagogues.
All right, so we have some great questions in here now, and I will also point out that if you give them a thumbs up, then you will vote them up, and we will be more likely to ask them, but not guaranteed. So next question, can you speak more about the idea that nationalizing the means of production doesn't necessarily translate to socialism?
And this is a controversial one. I always go back and forth about what it is I want. There are many capitalist societies that have nationalized nationalized industries. There have been, I believe, the British nationalized, the rails or coal. They've now privatized them thanks to Margaret Thatcher. I mean, they were still a capitalist society. Obviously, a lot of socialist political platforms have historically called for nationalization. So nationalization is sort of part of the socialist, I would argue, is part of the socialist project, but not everyone would agree with that. But if you still have sort of nationalized industry, but you still have this sort of relationship between the capitalists and the workers, it can still function within a capitalist society. And then other people have theories about state capitalism, which I'm not necessarily endorsing, which they use to explain societies in which the government, nationalized large swaths of industry, and they argued that the bureaucracy was still behaving the way capitalists did, and that the workers didn't control the means of production. But the theory of state capitalism is a very controversial one, and not one that I am either endorsing or unendorsing during this presentation.
Okay. Next up, did Marx deal with public servants, for example, teachers, and how their labor is extracted if they are not creating a product or performing a service for money?
Sure. So I'm not 100% sure if Marx specifically talked about teachers. Do you know if he did, David, or public servants?
Yeah. So specifically teachers, yeah.
Oh, he did.
And kind of in the framework you talked
The
about,
social
where,
production one, right?
well, in that, I think in that case he was talking about private teachers, and so the idea is that it was a service that was performed for money.
Sure. And the other thing, though, about teachers and people like that, what I would say would potentially fall within social reproduction theory, which is a Marxist theory that comes out in the 20th century from the feminist movement, which looks at how certain forms of labor are responsible for society to continue and for capitalism to reproduce itself and reproduce the worker, right? So you need schools, you need a functioning society. Without those things, capitalism ceases to function. So they are still being sort of exploited by capitalism in that sense, and that they are part of the maintenance of it.
Right. How is Marxism different from other forms of socialism?
That's a really good question. And I would say for me, sort of the socialists that came before Marx are sometimes referred to as the utopian socialist. They were very much interested in being like, here's my ideal socialist society, and in this commune, we'll turn water into lemonade, and the children will do the garbage collection because children like garbage, and not so much like, here is how capitalism functions. Marx was very much considered himself to be scientific in his thinking, not scientific in like I have a microscope and I've discovered how a human cell works, but that he was a little bit more rigorous than that. I would also say, there were some forms of Christian socialism or other forms of socialism that took a very different view of class struggle. Like, right, they were opposed to wage labor, as they saw it as akin to slavery or domination of one man over another, but they were sort of against class struggle and conflict because they thought everyone should just sort of get along. And it's not that Marx likes conflict, it's that Marx very much thought that, class conflict was inherent to capitalism, as I laid out in my presentation.
Next up, did Marx talk about the need for internationalism in creating a post-capitalist future? And if not, due to the globalized nature of capitalism today, are there Marxist theorists who have?
So Marx was a German guy. I believe he was from one of the pre-unification states. He spent some time in France, where he hung out with a guy named Proudhon. He later broke with Proudhon. This is how petty Karl Marx was. Proudhon wrote a book called The Philosophy of Poverty. Marx responded with a book called The Poverty of Philosophy. Even into, I believe, the third volume of Capital, Marx is still really attacking Proudhon. But the point was, spent some time in France, got expelled from there, was living in the UK. He wrote Capital in a British library. So Marx was very much an internationalist, and he was involved in setting up the first International Working Men's Association, which is sometimes referred to as the first international. If you hear people give numbers to internationals, the first international would be the one that Marx and also some anarchists like Bakunin were involved in setting up. Bakunin was expelled from it. Second International was those of the sort of social democratic, socialist parties that sort of come to the forefront between the period of Marx's death and the First World War. Then the Third International was the international of the communist parties that broke out of that. And then there was many fourth internationals of various Trotskyist groups trying to. So the point is that Marx was inherently an internationalist. He was very much an internationalist. Marxism is an internationalist tradition. The socialist tradition is an internationalist tradition.
Okay. Is it necessary to read Engels to understand Marx?
So that's a question that I have to my, I'm going to say no. First of all, I'm going to say I don't think it's necessarily to read Marx to understand Marxism. But I do think, I think it's helpful to read Marx. I think it's helpful to read Engels. I think it's helpful to read theory. I'm not one of these people who are like, oh, you know, you should never tell people to read theory. That's bad, right? Like the Black Panther Party had a pretty impressive political education program around Marx's education. So did the Communist Party in Alabama. On the other time, I'm not sort of into like this Marxist version of the Great Books program, where, you know, instead of like Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Ethics, it's you need to read, you know, Capital and then this Lenin book and this thing. I think you can be a great socialist without having read the classics. I think reading them makes you a better socialist. Someone has written, and I'm going to jump the question stack, David, what work by Marx would you recommend to start reading? I would recommend Wage, Labor, and Capital and Value, Price, and Profit. They're both extremely short, extremely readable pamphlets that go into sort of the big ideas he expounds upon in thousands upon thousands of pages in Capital. Some people like to start with the Communist Manifesto. I think that's a good one. I think it's a little bit less good at sort of laying out, you know, the wage-labor relationship. I'm clearly, my preference for Marx skews towards his political economy. Other people might give different book suggestions. David, what would you suggest?
I think it really depends. So I think your suggestion is a good one. I think the manifesto is great as long as you remember that it's a manifesto. It's not a theoretical or historical work. So yeah. All right. So we have next question. It says, great talk, but can something only have value if it's sold? With bread, for example, what if you were making your own bread in a famine? It would still have greater value even if you weren't necessarily selling it to yourself only. As here we're talking about exchange value.
So that is an excellent point. And I was not saying that bread only had value if it was sold in like a moral sense or how I value bread. I was talking about from the perspective of capitalism. Capitalism is a system of production for profit. So things only have value if they help to generate profit. So, and I believe I stated that's completely perverse and completely absurd. Producing bread free of charge during a famine is far more useful than like baking 12 bagels at Panera Bread, selling them to some dude, and then having that guy dump them in the trash. I almost hate to even introduce the phrase productive versus unproductive labor, because that has a moral sound to it. And it's not, you know, here's what we as socialists, here's what we as human beings assign a moral value to. It's here is how capitalism determines what's productive and what's unproductive. And by pointing out that capitalism only considers labor productive if it satisfies an exchange value, regardless of what the use value is to point out to me how perverse and absurd of a situation capitalism is. So you are correct that the person making the bread during the famine is doing something far more useful than someone producing something for profit that might not get used. The fact that the capitalist system doesn't feel that way shows the fundamental flaws of capitalism. Not your thinking. Your thinking is absolutely correct. And I'm 100% with you.
Okay, next up, what are some of the different types of Marxism that you mentioned, Chip?
I don't think I'm going to get in this evening to different sort of types of Marxism. I'm just going to say there's a lot of different people who consider themselves being Marxist or influenced by Marx, and they have very different views on certain things. one of the biggest debates and also one of the most esoteric, in my opinion, and one that I personally cannot follow, is the debate around the transition question. How do we transition from feudalism to capitalism? One of the only times in my life I ever thought I was in a room where immediate violence was about to break out was when I was at a Marx conference in New York City, and we were on a panel discussion about like what would Marx have said about like grain production in like 1805 Ohio, and people got sort of disputing about which theory of the transition of capital applies here, and they were getting very, very rowdy. I cannot imagine getting that impassioned about grain production in Ohio in 1805, but some Marxists can be into people. But the other big fights, though, are the political fights of the 20th century, parliamentarism versus revolution. How do you relate to the Soviet Union? How do you relate to social democratic parties? Things like that. You know, you would have people who would say Soviet Union very good, and people would say no, Soviet Union very bad, both of which would be Marxist. And they would probably both claim Marxist theory as being making their perspective correct and the other one wrong. Though those types of arguments I think are more historically specific than about the underlying theory. Do you have anything you want to throw in there, David?
No, I think we should keep going. So next question. Did Marx have much to say about the environmental impacts of capitalism, or did that develop later?
So Marx does have some comments about environmental impacts of capitalism. Many eco-socialists feel very strongly about what he said. I believe he talked about the depletion of the quality of soil or something like that. I mean, David always says this, that there's sort of two schools of how you address any of these questions within Marxism, one of which is that Marx, you know, covered this and had all the answers, and the other one is which, you know, later people using Marx's framework came up with this. I think that there was writings in Marx about environmentalism, and I think that eco-socialists were able to draw from that and develop them and take them even further. I think even if Marx had neglected the environment, or if Marx had terrible views on the environment, his method of analyzing capitalism would still have given eco-socialists a powerful tool for leveling their critiques.
Okay. To what extent does an understanding of Marxism inform our understanding of racism?
That is a good question. So you'll hear some people who will make this claim that Marx never thought about race, Marx never thought about racism, and therefore Marxists never talk about racism, and therefore, you know, Marx and Marxism is irrelevant. You'll have other people go through and point out the ways in which, you know, Marx was opposed to slavery. He had comments about how labor cannot be branded in its cannot be free in the white skin where it is branded in the black skin. He has some comments, I think, in commodity fetishism about sort of racialized slavery that some people read as a refutation of biological racism. I also think that more importantly than what Marx maybe said is that other thinkers in the Black Marxist tradition have taken Marxist framework in different directions and used it to analyze and understand racism. And obviously amongst these people, there's, you know, several leftists, how many opinions about how this works. But you have someone like Barbara Fields, who does a really good materialist analysis, in my opinion, of how racism emerged as an ideology in the US as sort of a necessity to sort of justify certain forms of exploitation and slavery. You also have someone like Allen, who is in fact the originator of the term white privilege, although the way he used white privilege is very different than the way we use it today. He thought of white privilege as not being an advantage that workers have, and therefore white workers have, and therefore makes them lacking in solidarity with Black workers because they have this great advantage. He described white privilege as being poison bait on a hook, and that to argue that this is his views, this is what he said, and that to argue that white privilege was good for white workers is to argue that swallowing the hook is good for the fish. And he made this claim that if you looked at the three types of industry, obviously there's more than three types of industry, but looked at the three types of industry: auto workers, miners, and textile workers, obviously very skewed towards particular types of professions, though sort of interesting because, you know, a lot of times the foundation liberal white privilege type people would probably not be thinking about coal miners, textile workers, or auto workers at all. The one in his mind where white privilege was the most pronounced was in textile working, and that textile working also had the worst conditions for workers across the board, according to Allen. And we can dispute this, of course. I'm just explaining what he said. And I think it's interesting to return to what he said, since he did coin the term white skin privilege, that auto workers had the least amount of white privilege in their industry and had the best working conditions of those three industries. And he wrote a whole book called The Invention of the White Race, which was very much his pushback on biological racism or cultural explanations for racism, and coming up with sort of materialist explanations for racism. And I believe Fields, the person I mentioned earlier, and Allen were not necessarily on the same page, but, you know, they both sort of did a materialist analysis of how race developed. Boots Riley of The Coup, who also made the film Sorry to Bother You, had a really good comment about racism and capitalism, an issue that is really, I think, explored very well in his film. I'm sorry, I'm pulling it up now. I interviewed Boots Riley for Jacobin, so I really want to talk to him about how he saw the relationship between racism and capitalism, because he's, of course, a Marxist. He comes from a Marxist-Leninist tradition, and he is also an African-American man, very concerned with racism. And his film really is one of the most interesting meditations on the relationship between race and class in the US I've ever seen. Most of the reviews, you know, didn't pick up on that. And, you know, he said, hold on one second. If you give me a minute, I will pick this out. Class society. Of course I can't. Of course I suddenly can't find it. He says that racist ideas about how people are colored, how poverty is explained. I suddenly cannot find this quotation. I believe I read it during yours presentation, David, but basically says something like, you know, what comes first, class or racism, right? We're in a capitalist society. Racism stems from that, but also it upholds it. So what do? Go for class or race first? And he sort of made it clear that the two were intertwined.
Okay, so the Next question, and the only one we have left in the queue, and you talked about this a little bit, but you might have some more thoughts.
Can I actually, I found the quote.
Sure.
Can I read it?
Go for it.
He's much more articulate than I am. He said, race and class are inextricably tied. We are often looking at race separate from class. Which one is more important? Well, because we have a class system, racism is necessary to uphold it. You're not going to get rid of racism without getting rid of capitalism. On the other hand, you're not going to be able to have a movement that gets rid of capitalism without also working to get rid of racism at the same time. I think that's an excellent quote. Obviously, I know there are some Marxists or self-proclaimed Marxists who tell people to ignore race altogether, and there are certain people who have come out of a Marx-like tradition and have sort of argued that class contradictions are completely subsumed into racial ones. And I don't find either of those points of views persuasive. And I also think, the high point of the Marxist tradition is the way in which people have been able to give good explanations of how racism is part of the capitalist society, but also how it isn't just, if we all have healthcare, then racism goes away, because that's not the case either.
Okay. So the last question on the board is, how is Marxism different from other forms of socialism?
I think I answered that one.
You did talk about this already.
So, so Marxism, you could make an argument, and I've heard people make this argument, that Marxism isn't an ideology or political platform, it's a method of analysis. So therefore, socialism is the ideology and Marxism is the method of analysis socialist uses. Obviously, the person making that argument is a Marxist and wants you to think that all all socialists must be Marxist. But that's an interesting argument. Another thing, as I pointed out before, is that sort of pre-Marx, there's what Marx called the utopian socialist as opposed to the scientific socialist. And they were very interested in setting up communes or things like that. Marx wasn't so much let's go out into the woods and, share our acorns together type kind of guy. He saw capitalism as a totalizing process, and you couldn't withdraw from it. You needed a political solution to it. He focused on class conflict, which some forms of Christian socialism, not all, but I think, were uncomfortable with, because we should all get along. And there was these sort of versions of socialism that were both the worker and the capitalist will be better off in socialism. So the worker should just, come to the table with the capitalist and both convince each other how much, better their lives would be, which, give it a try. And I think those are the big points and the ones I mentioned before.
Okay. Any other questions for us?
Well, I don't know if that's because I'm so thorough or so incomprehensible.
Well, we had a lot of good questions clarifying.
We did. We had excellent questions.
That may be part of it. Yeah.
I've done this 5-6 times, and I think tonight was the best. Don't tell the other people, but I think tonight was the best questions we've had. And I'm not just doing the Mick Jagger thing from The Simpsons, where it's every town I'm in is the best town I'm in. Is Christian Marxism possible? Yeah, I think Christian Marxism is possible. I think that there are people who are Christians who definitely are Marxist. I think, when the Communist Party went into Alabama, right, they were dealing with people who oftentimes were very religious. And those people were totally able to participate in party life. When I said certain forms of Christian socialist, I didn't mean to say all Christians who were socialist. I was thinking about a particular group of people who existed in the US Midwest in the 19th century and had very intriguing ideas. How would Marx take a look at the neoliberal flavor of capitalism specifically? That is a really good question. I think that Marx would do what Marx always does. I think he would have, on the one hand, talked about these sorts of, quote unquote, universal laws of capitalism, this sort of big picture look at capitalism. And then I would think he would look at how they were applied in the current situation and what the current politics looked like. So, for example, certain Marxist takes on neoliberalism, like David Harvey's take on neoliberalism, is this idea that neoliberalism is a product of class restoration, class power restoration, that at the end of the 60s and 70s, workers through social democratic states and robust labor movements had gotten more powerful. They were demanding more from their bosses. You see other rebellions during this time, such as fights for Black liberation, women's liberation, in the quote unquote third world, what was then called the third world, what we would call the global south today. You saw national liberation movements striking back at the colonial domination imposed upon them, many through an explicitly socialist framework. So if you were a capitalist, the world seemed sort of a bit under siege for you. And that neoliberalism is about going in and reestablishing the capitalist discipline over the worker. And, then if you're a Marxist of this variety, you can look at things like the types of they're not laws, but types of theories with how wage labor works in the abstract to explain what's going on there. I think that's how Marx may have done so. I want to say I'm channeling Marx and this is the correct interpretation of the last 40 years he embraced. And I know some Marxists really hate that version of neoliberalism, but that's sort of the predominant one of Marxist. I don't know if that made sense. David, did I make sense with that one or?
Sure. Okay. Any final questions for us? All right, got one more.
How does Marx split with anarchy? So Marx and Bakunin had a number of falling outs over a number of specific issues. Marx was very much believed in mass movements and collective class struggle, probably through the form of political parties. Bakunin, not so much. A lot of these arguments also people take to be about the nature of the state, whereas some anarchists sort of see the state, not capitalism, as the problem, and that, capitalism flows from the state, whereas Marx in his theoretical framework wanted to, in the long run, wither away the state and create a stateless society that he called communism, that is very similar to what people think of as anarchism. But in the intermediate period, he wanted, workers to receive state power. He also was for universal franchisement and things like that. So sort of the general sorts of disagreements between anarchists and other types of leftists, with some probably highly esoteric historical disagreements and probably a non-insignificant amount of personal animosity between those two, Bakunin and Marx.
Okay, so maybe this could be the last one. We've got, is amplifying Marx wise in this political moment?
So yeah, Donald Trump is really ranting and raving about Marxism and turning it into a boogeyman. I've been doing this presentation for since when, David? Since when did we start this? A year before the night school, and we've been doing the night school for 2 or 3 years.
That's right.
I gave my first presentation on Marxist political economy during Occupy Wall Street, which was a decade ago. I think Marxist theoretical frameworks are important, and I don't think we should run away from them. I do understand that Donald Trump is making these inflammatory comments about Marxists, but he's also making inflammatory comments about the left and about socialism and about people who don't think the police should murder Black people. So, I agree you should be careful and not go out and do something like ridiculously inflammatory or over the top that sort of emboldens or justifies Trump. But I also don't think there's anything the left can do where Trump won't demonize them. So how do you draw the line between not doing something unnecessarily inflammatory versus coping with the fact that anyone who opposes racism, anyone who opposes imperialism, anyone who thinks, people shouldn't starve to death if they're working, shouldn't starve to death, period. But certainly people who are working shouldn't be paid starvation wages, is some sort of like demonic entity. I don't know. That's a tough balance to strike. I'm willing to defend the Marxist tradition. I think the presentation I laid out tonight, even if someone disagreed with it, I don't think they would be necessarily scandalized by it. But I do realize for a lot of people, Marxism is like these claims to my Glenn Beck or Tucker Carlson, whoever's on the TV now. I don't keep up with, latest right-wing demagogue of the week that like Marxism is, people putting pornography in the libraries to collapse the American state and round you all up in FEMA camps. But yes, surplus value and profit, I would say, are one and the same in the end. I think a pedantic Marxist might draw some sort of theoretical distinction between the two of them, but for the purposes of our sort of baseline understanding of Marx, I think it is fine to treat them as the same. Do you think that's correct, David, or?
As a first cut, yeah.
As a first cut, yes. As the third or fourth cut, maybe we can draw some differences.
Last call for questions. All right. Well, this is a good stopping point anyway, because you all asked some great questions and Chip has answered them well. So I want to thank everyone for coming, and I want to thank Chip for once again doing this presentation for us as one of the foundations of our Socialist Night School. So really happy to have that once again. The other thing we're going to do is tell you, as I said, some ways that you could get involved if you want to in the chapter. So give me 1 second here. Okay. If you are not currently a member and would like to be a member, you can learn more at mdcdsa.org/new members. You can join and learn how to get plugged in. You can contact us, Chip and I, the Socialist Night School team, at politicaleducation@mdcdsa.org. You can also find us on Twitter at nightschool_DC. And if you're in the chapter, we're on the chapter Slack at political-education. You can find past events, including this one, up on the Metro DC DSA YouTube channel. And also, if you check out the Night School website, mdcdsa.org/night school, that's going to have past events and resources from past events going back to well into the fourth semester, which we had 22 sessions that semester. So there's a lot of stuff up there. The other thing is we're going to take a little time off, but we're going to come back after the election with a session on Medicare for All. That's going to be November 23rd. We're going to have the full information about that soon. That's going to be a panel event. I think that's going to be great. And then more stuff to come. So in the meantime, we're going to be planning the rest of this fifth semester. So hopefully you can make that. Hopefully you can get plugged in with the chapter and also with us. And with that, I think we will say goodnight.